Yes, I can. My
Okay,
apologies.
okay. Thank you for being patient. Over to you, Mike.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you to COPAIR for organizing this very interesting interdisciplinary cross-geographic event. I really have learned a lot. So I guess at this point, the advantage of being the final speaker is that all of the key things that have been said have been said. Um, but I'll try to fill in some gaps and perhaps highlight some key points that were made by others in my own comments. Yeah, there's been so much geopolitical churn in the Middle East in recent months, and there's so much that one can talk about in this context. But what I thought I would do is highlight what I regard to be perhaps two of, or maybe the two biggest Big Bang events for a region, for a Middle East region that's had a lot of Big Bang events of late, certainly over the course of this year. One of them would be the U.S. government's decision to kill Qasem Soleimani, and the other is the very recent agreement between Israel and the UAE. And so I'll address these two issues from two perspectives that I would like to think I understand the most. One is the thinking here in Washington behind these two moves, and the other is the implications of these two moves for South Asia, including Pakistan. So let's start with the Soleimani killing. The Trump administration has been on a collision course with Iran throughout its time in power. Trump has shown a willingness to be unconventional, to say the least, and to change course with longstanding rivals by pursuing conciliatory paths. So North Korea stands out here for sure. President Trump has never shied away from his personal affinities for Vladimir Putin. And Trump also, lest we forget, had expressed a lot of fondness for Xi Jinping during the early parts of Trump's term. But with Iran, there has been, for Trump, an unusual degree of consistency and predictability with Iran policy. There's been a fairly hard line from day one since the Trump administration took office, outside of some observations here and there about the idea of pursuing talks or negotiations with Iran. But that's really an anomaly. Trump and his chief advisors, who have included some of the biggest Iran hawks out there, hated the US civil nuclear deal with Iran and wanted to get out of it. They did not like Obama's relatively, I emphasize relatively, conciliatory policies toward Iran. And I think that some context is important here. Ever since the revolution, ever since the '79 revolution, Iran has not just been persona non grata in the US. I mean, diplomatically, relations are not there, but more broadly, perceptions of Iran have been incredibly negative in Washington for so long. It's really been demonized on some levels, not just from a policy lens, but also through the media and society. I would argue that few countries are as demonized as much as Iran has been in the US in recent history. And I think that this demonization has blinded many Americans to the fact that the US and Iran actually share a number of interests in South Asia, including their support for a peaceful and prosperous Afghanistan. But that's another story. At any rate, my point here is that the Obama administration's desire to try to improve relations, even if only modestly, with Iran was really a game changer for US diplomacy on many levels, and something that many within the political class in Washington, and particularly Republicans and later Trump Republicans, simply could not tolerate. So the Trump administration, I believe, has felt compelled to take a particularly hardline position on Iran in order to change course from Obama's conciliation, and also as part of Trump's efforts to strengthen U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia, a country that Trump has long been quite fond of, and a country that has seen its relations with the U.S. That had seen its relations with the U.S. decline a bit during the Obama years when Obama engaged in his outreach to Iran. And so I think this helps explain, in part at least, why the Trump administration made the very bold decision to target Soleimani, someone that the Trump administration had and continues to describe as a terrorist in the same category of a bin Laden or a Baghdadi. Now, the Trump administration certainly understood the risks of targeting him, particularly in terms of the risks of intensifying an already volatile rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and more broader volatility in a region invested with tremendous strategic significance for Washington. But again, the Trump administration takes a hard line on Iran and wanted to make a very forceful statement, which it did. So what have been some of the implications of the Soleimani killing for South Asia? I'll briefly highlight three, which follow from the assumption that the killing worsens US-Iran relations and heightens volatility in the Middle East. So first, Afghanistan, just across Iran's eastern border, could potentially be a site for Tehran-sponsored reprisals on US interests. US troops may be on their way out of Afghanistan, which they are, but there are still around 8,000 right now. Even with that number expected to be reduced by another few thousand in the next few months, there are still more US troops in Afghanistan than in any other part of Iran's wider neighborhood outside of Kuwait and Qatar. Iran has potential proxy partners in Afghanistan capable of carrying out strikes on US troops. One option is the Taliban, which has received limited military support from Iran in the past, though this is less likely since the US Taliban agreement signed in February this year that effectively rules out Taliban attacks on US troops. So perhaps a more serious potential threat to US troops in Afghanistan is the Fatmayun division, a militia mainly comprised of Afghan Shias that Tehran had deployed to Syria to battle the Islamic State there. Additionally, the background and the resume of Ismail Qani, Soleimani's successor and former deputy, I think really underscores the possibility of Iranian reprisals in Afghanistan. Qani oversaw Quds Force operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan for that matter. And he had a hand in the formation of the Fatmayun group. So in other words, he knows the terrain. I think the second implication of the Soleimani killing for South Asia is economic. The potential for heightened volatility in the Middle East has and continues to threaten Indian and Pakistani interests, both of which have, both Pakistan and India have extensive commercial ties to the Middle East. And this is nothing to sneeze at, especially given the major economic challenges faced by both countries, which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. India and Pakistan are also deeply dependent on energy resources from the Middle East, and Islamabad relies heavily on economic support from the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are two of its top donors. Gulf nations are key investment partners for New Delhi. And also the Arab Gulf is home to nearly 9 million Indian and nearly 4 million Pakistani workers, and they are a critical source of remittances back home. A third implication for South Asia is diplomatic. India and Pakistan need to find ways to balance their respective relationships with Washington and Tehran. New Delhi is intent on strengthening a growing defense partnership with the US, even while continuing to pursue a largely commercially focused relationship with Iran that is increasingly undermined by American sanctions on Tehran. Now for Islamabad, I think the balancing act is more complex. US-Pakistan relations have enjoyed a bit of a renaissance amid increased cooperation in Afghanistan over the last 18 months or so, over the peace process there. Islamabad is keen to maintain that goodwill, I think, in the hopes that Washington will eventually end its suspension of Pakistani security assistance and expand bilateral trade and investment. But Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has sought stronger ties with Tehran as part of an effort to better position Islamabad as a neutral player in the Iran-Saudi Arabia rivalry. Riyadh has long been one of Islamabad's closest allies, but it's a relationship that, as I think we all know, has run into some trouble in recent weeks amid a spat over Islamabad's perception that Saudi Arabia is not being sufficiently supportive of the Kashmir issue, which is hugely important for Pakistan. Against the backdrop of escalating US-Iran tensions, the stakes are particularly high for Pakistani diplomacy. Pakistan, of course, shares a frequently volatile border with Iran that experiences periodic cross-border violence perpetrated by Pakistan-based anti-Iran militants. About 20% of Pakistan's 200 million strong population is Shia, the largest Shia community outside of Iran. And Pakistan has security partnerships with both Washington and Riyadh, Tehran's biggest rivals. Pakistan is at risk of getting dragged into two rapidly intensifying rivalries, Washington and Tehran and Saudi Arabia, at a time when it is really keen to stay out of both. So now let's turn to what I would describe as a second Big Bang event in the Mideast this year, and that is this recent Israel-UAE deal. I know there's something else brewing that's come out with Bahrain, but let's stick with the Israel-UAE deal. So first, what was the U.S. reasoning for pursuing the UAE-Israel deal? Now, we've heard from several previous speakers who unlike me, are actually Middle East specialists who have, I think, laid out very nicely U.S. policy toward Israel and the broader region, what's going on. What I'll say here is just to, I think, underscore a very obvious point that Israel has long been a key focus of the Trump administration. It has always been a focus of successive U.S. governments. Israel is one of America's top allies, and while the relationship did flounder a little bit in the Obama years, it's been strengthened in a really big way in the Trump years. And in fact, I think that the U.S. relationship with Iran is arguably one of the very few key U.S. bilateral partnerships that has not suffered in the Trump era. Its relationship with India, the U.S. relationship with India, is probably one of the only others. So Israel has been a huge focus, and the advisors that Trump respects the most, like the aforementioned Jared Kushner, have had a laser-like focus on Israel, from the issue of changing the location of the U.S. embassy to pursuing a peace deal with the Palestinians. The peace deal with the Palestinians, of course, didn't work out very well, so the administration turned its attention to other ways that it could make some big moves with Israel in the region, and that led to the chain of events that resulted in the Israel-UAE deal. And I think there are several factors at play driving this move, and I would argue that they are more tied to U.S. domestic politics than to foreign policy. I mean, certainly for sure, the Trump administration is keen to have Israel enjoy more normalized relationships in the Middle East and to integrate it, or to help integrate it into the Middle East in an effort to create more regional stability, and also to undercut Tehran, which has no interest in reconciling with Israel and faces the prospect of several of its Saudi-aligned Arab rivals making peace with Israel. But we also need to look at what's playing out in the US. Trump is, above all, a deal maker, or at least that's how he likes to project himself, a businessman who relishes the art of the deal. Trump has faced so many scandals and crises as president that I think there's a desire on his part to sharpen perceptions of him as someone who knows how to get things done and serve US interests. And in this regard, the Israel deal is just what the doctor ordered. In addition, with the US election fast approaching and Trump arguably more vulnerable than he's been at any other point during his presidency, I think there's a particularly strong incentive to get a deal like this, and the administration hopes a few others with Israel and its Arab neighbors before the election. Now, this may overstate the interest that the average US voter takes in foreign affairs. Many Americans, including those within his core Republican base, would pay no mind to or even be aware of a new deal involving Israel and the UAE. One exception may be the Christian conservatives within Trump's political base that are strongly pro-Israel, but still, in my view, there is a strong domestic political motivation that has fueled the US pursuit of this Israel deal. And so what are the implications of this deal for South Asia? And here I'll focus specifically on India and Pakistan. First, Pakistan, which has never had formal ties with Israel, may face some unwanted and uncomfortable questions. It's interesting that soon after the inking of the deal, some commentators wondered aloud publicly if Pakistan could be tempted to follow the UAE's lead and pursue normalized ties with Israel. Now, Prime Minister Khan quickly quashed that speculation. Very soon after the deal, he reasserted in a TV interview that Pakistan's long-standing position is that it will not normalize ties with Israel until there is a two-state solution to which the Palestinians agree. And indeed, I think it is a remote prospect for Pakistan to normalize relations with Israel, which I'm happy to go into later. But it is notable that several senior Pakistani leaders in the recent past, including Pervez Musharraf, who was a military dictator for a number of years, they called for better ties with Israel over the last few decades. A few leaders have done that. Benazir Bhutto was another one. Back in 2005, in Turkey, Israeli and Pakistani foreign ministers met publicly for the first time ever. There's also been some degrees of covert cooperation between the two sides in previous decades. The Pakistan-Israel relationship is, if nothing else, very complex and very sensitive, and Islamabad likely prefers that questions about it stay out of the public sphere, and yet the UAE-Israel deal could invite the very questions that Pakistan would much rather avoid. Second, this deal coming not too long after the Soleimani killing throws more fuel on the fire of a raging Saudi Arabia-Iran rivalry that casts a deep shadow across Pakistan, given its relations with both countries, and especially amid the recent Pakistan-Saudi Arabia spat over Kashmir, and amid the new agreement between Iran and China, which suggests that Islamabad, following its Chinese allies' lead, may be tempted to try to edge a bit closer to Iran. And so the UAE-Iran deal, by giving Riyadh and Tehran, or by driving Riyadh and Tehran further apart, could give the Saudis and Iranians greater incentives to try to pressure Pakistan to help them pursue their respective regional interests. Now, New Delhi has a friendly and growing relationship with Israel, and it tends not to get dragged into the Iran-Saudi Arabia rivalry because, unlike Pakistan, it does not have very deep or very poor relations with either country. But with New Delhi trying to scale up its relations with countries across the Middle East, the rivalry between the region's two most consequential players, other than Israel, I think will be difficult for India to avoid. The UAE-Israel deal risks further undermining India's already floundering relationship with Iran, a key commercial and especially energy partner for New Delhi, until US sanctions in recent years took their toll and began to hamper India's ability to do business with Iran. The UAE-Israel deal, I imagine, will deliver, and already has delivered, another blow to US-Iran relations. And this ensures, especially if the Trump administration returns for a second term, ensures the continuation of harsh US sanctions on Iran that in recent years have compelled India, a close and growing partner of Washington's, to scale down its energy imports from Tehran, formerly one of New Delhi's top foreign suppliers. Compounding all of this is the Iran-China agreement, which could well compel Tehran to invite Beijing, instead of New Delhi, to develop the Chabahar port in southern Iran, which was originally part of a wider envisioned transport corridor project involving India, Iran, and Afghanistan. And as I believe was mentioned by one of the speakers before, there are indications that India may not be, or maybe pushed out, so to speak, of Chabahar. Iran is losing interest, is growing impatient with India as India moves slowly and cautiously amid US sanctions on India. And there's been a lot of mixed reportage as to whether India has been dropped out of a envisioned railway project involving Chabahar port. That was the original press reports, but then there have been subsequent rejections of those reports from both the Iranian and Indian government. So at least at this point, India remains a part of the Chabahar transport corridor project with Iran and Afghanistan, but its future role is certainly in doubt. The bottom line to conclude is that the Soleimani killing and the Israel-UAE deal are two watershed developments for international relations with far-reaching implications for South Asian states that have major interests and stakes in the Middle East, and particularly specifically referring to India and Pakistan. So thank you very much.